Hi, everyone. I see everyone is busy joining. Please tell us in the chat where you're from, what you wanted to get out of today's session. We have Pretoria. Welcome, Patrice. We have both Simon and Geoff online. So please let us know where you're from. We want to be fully interactive today. So if you have any questions, pop them in the chat. If the chat gets too busy, then pop them in the Q&A, and that'll highlight to us that it is a question that needs to be answered. If we don't get to everybody's questions today, then we will keep a list of them and respond to them on the website. As you know, Simon, hi Sarah, nice to see you online. Simon is introducing both his book as well as the course today. So Simon will tell you a little bit more about that today. Just waiting for the last of everyone to start joining. We've got Pretoria, we've got Cape Town. Where else is everyone from? I see we've got, I'm just looking at the attendee. Bill, welcome. Nice to see you online. Catherine Bounier, nice to see you too. I'm really glad you got the link. My team said that you had a little bit of problems getting the link, so nice to see you back online. And Gavin, all the way from in North Africa, welcome to Gavin. Marx, you're online, excellent. Miguel, Nicholas Swan, that's very nice to see, and Nimit. So Nimit joins from Turkey, and I've yet to know one webinar, the Good Governance Academy, where she hasn't joined. So welcome, and thank you so much for being our most supportive fan. I'm going to start the webinar now. Thank you very much to everyone who's joined. I'd just like to first of all introduce Simon, who's going to talk to us about both his book. So it's a book lounge event today, as well as showcasing his program that goes with it. And his training program is one of our most recently endorsed programs, endorsed by the Good Governance Academy. If you want to know how to get your program endorsed, please get us, send us an email, get in touch, and we'll go through a process. It is independently reviewed content of the highest standard, and that's what the Good Governance Academy stands for. I'd also like to introduce Geoff. Geoff is the past chair of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange. He's been on several boards and he brings a lot of knowledge and understanding. So Geoff is the perfect person to join us today in looking behind the closed doors, behind the boardroom doors. But without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Simon. And Simon, if you could just introduce yourself in a little bit more detail and tell us about why you wrote the book and why you're doing the course. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Callan, and I'm honoured to be joining the webcast. So thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a businessman. I've been on boards now for over 30 years, both as an executive, a CFO, but also as a non-executive director, and also as a chairman of several different companies. And in my time, I've run into a lot of burning buildings. So I've seen, most CVs talk about, oh, I work for blah, I work for blah, I work for blah. I look at a CV as I've faced this issue. So, for example, I've had regulatory inquiries, I've done takeovers, I've been taken over, we've had boardroom disputes, shareholder revolts, I've been nationalised at one point, we've had financial and cash crises, we've had successful IPOs and successful equity raises. So I think what matters is your experience, not the names on your CV. And, I'd been 10 years as a FTSE-100 CFO, and I thought I knew everything. And then I became a non-exec. My first non-exec was joining the board of Northern Rock, the UK-based bank, which had the first run for 150 years. Just joined it just after the run. And I thought I knew, but I realized actually sitting on one side of the table, you don't understand what it's like on the other. So my learning as a board director, it didn't begin, but certainly half of it at least started only when I became a non-exec. And I became very aware that there's no training, or almost no training, for how you work as a board director, and especially as a non-exec. And I think we need to improve board performance. There have been many scandals across the world, and not all of them are due to board poor performance, but a lot of them have been exacerbated, made worse by directors who were not quick enough to spot what was happening. And look, better governance rules are important. Absolutely, they're the basis. But actually understanding how you take decisions, how you tackle risk, how you understand risk, how you look at performance is even more important. It's a bit like someone says to you, I want to improve the performance of my football team. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to teach the rules of the game to your players. Well, the players have got to know the rules, but it isn't going to improve their performance as a team. What will improve their performance as a team are tactics, strategies. If he hits the ball over here, you do this. If somebody shoots from long range, you do this. And that's what I'm trying to talk about, which is what do you do on a board, not the rules around governance. And I'm passionate that we need to help directors to be better prepared for situations, a difficult situation, new situation. I mean, if you serve on a board and you've got a novel situation you're being bid for, you've not seen it before, one of the nicest experiences in the whole world is sitting there and someone else around that boardroom says, yeah, I've had that, and this is what you do, and this is what you need to watch for. And that, I think, is the key of what I'm trying to do, to give to people that sort of experience and advice and knowledge on what to question. So I wrote the book Behind Closed Doors. It was published this time last year and has sold well. It's available through Amazon as a Kindle or a paperback. And it really runs through board issues, and it uses my experience and anecdotes. So there's no governance, as you would traditionally know, legal and company secretary. It's all about, if this happens, make sure you ask that question and watch it, because somebody will probably tell you that, and that's not totally true. It's full of tips and advice. Having published the book, I wanted to develop it and get some one-to-one tuition going, so that I could go out and talk to people about the sort of issues. And the online course, so anybody in the world can join because it's online, but it's one-to-one. It's direct teaching with me. We talk about becoming a director, using risk and understanding risk, the absolute essentials you need to know about finance, how the audit committee needs to take decisions, what's important in remuneration, nomination, how you deal with shareholders and acquisitions and being bid for. So it's had great feedback, and I think the issues I talk about are the issues that face almost all boards at some point or another. And I'm delighted to talk about some of those in more detail this afternoon. Thanks.
Thanks, Simon. It's so much. I've been putting some in the chat, so much food for thought. But yes, how to become a Streetwise director and how to teach being Streetwise. To Geoff, what are your kind of senses in terms of a director being Streetwise? What are those key lessons that you think generically a director needs to learn about being Streetwise?
Thanks very much, Carolyn. I too am grateful to be on this webinar, and thank you. And good afternoon to all the audience, and thank you for taking time to listen to us. I would say the most important thing about being a director is, why are you appointed a director? What does it require of you? Does it require just 4 meetings a year, some subcommittees, or does it require awareness for 365 days a year? And I think as a director, when we're appointed, we're actually a director for 365 days a year. You're expected to know about the corporation or the entity that you're part and parcel of. You're expected to apply your mind in the best interests of the corporate or the entity. You're not there for, should I say, vested interests. You're there to make sure that the corporation or the entity does as well as it can, is guided as best as you can help guide it with your co-directors. new on a board, listen. All too often we think we know it, but I think, as Simon has correctly said, every time you go into a situation, you learn new things, you have new things thrust in front of you, and it's a matter of being able to apply yourself as best as you can. Make sure also, when one sits as a chairman, one wants to be assured that you've got the best talent on the board, that you're utilizing the insights of the executives as well. They've had experience. They've been face to face with many of the problems that will confront the board. And therefore, the more you take the best out of all your executive and all your directors, the better prepared you will be to confront the sort of risks that may appear before you, or give the direction or help with the strategy in a way that is meaningful. So for me, the summary is, be aware why you're there as a director, or chairman. Be aware of your responsibilities when you sit as a chairman. I believe it's your duty to get the best out of everybody and to make sure that you listen. You don't always have to follow, but you can listen and assess, and that's what I would say.
Thank you, Geoff. So, yes, Simon, please button.
I agree very much with Geoff there, and one of the really important points he's making is that most of the work as a director, whether executive or non-exec, happens outside the boardroom, and too much governance is all about the boardroom. It's partly because company secretaries do a lot of it, and that's their focus. But actually, in terms of taking the right decision, it's one-to-one conversations and telephone calls and Zoom calls that you have outside. So one of the things I say to people is, a good board meeting will have a number of one-to-one conversations in advance. For example, if you pick up a board paper and you think, that's a bit odd, I don't understand that, or I'm not sure I agree with it, don't stay silent and then wait till the agenda 5 on the board meeting. Pick the phone up and call the chairman or the chair of the committee or the CEO and say, can you explain that? I'm not sure. And you not only make the board more efficient, but in my experience, you will flush out issues that you hadn't spotted before. Would you agree with that, Geoff?
I fully agree with it. You come to the question about board packs as well. And I think one finds today in many entities that board packs are so voluminous and not timeous that directors don't have the opportunity to apply themselves fully. So timing of board packs, proper preparation, full details, and the ability, as you so correctly say, to ask questions ahead of time so that you're properly prepared, I think are all very important.
Simon, you use the term vigilant. So that's we've been speaking about some of the aspects of vigilance, but there's also that other aspect that's focusing on what the organization gives to you, and maybe even your assurance providers from your risk, etc. But what about being vigilant? And you mentioned it, looking at what, and Geoff also mentioned it, looking at the context of the organization, the 365 story Geoff was talking about.
Especially if you're a non-exec, it's very easy to keep quiet. If there's something going wrong, it's a lot easier just to, well, look, I'm a non-exec. I'm sure the execs, no, I'm sure the chairperson is sorting it out, and to shy away from conflict. And after all, it's not your full-time job. You might do 1-2 days a month or something. You can go off and do something else. And that's really a siren call to poor performance. And I think it's one of the points I think Geoff was making, talking about vigilance. You have to do things that make your life more difficult. Because if things aren't right, you should, instead of just say, it's a bit like directors approving things they don't understand. Now, if you look at the financial crisis, 2007-8 great financial crisis, the thing that strikes you when you read about it is how the boards of those banks and insurance companies and the regulators did not understand derivatives, and they didn't understand the interaction of derivatives. And then you had, in that, post that, you had a lot of companies, particularly property companies globally, failing or being in big trouble because they signed on to interest rate swaps, and interest rates have gone down. And the swaps nearly killed vast quantities of property companies across the world. And what had happened is that boards had been signing on to strategies and financial instruments that they didn't understand. And one of the things I say is, don't approve something you don't understand. If it's if you've got to spend some time understanding it, spend that time, not necessarily in a board meeting. But that's the danger, isn't it, Geoff? That it's just so easy. Oh, well, you assume somebody else understands it, so you let it go, and you later on you find they didn't.
I couldn't agree with you more. And every board has the opportunity also to call in outside expertise where they need help. And I think one of the most important things, as you so correctly said, is you need to have an understanding of what's going on. You need to get the requisite experience, hopefully within the board, but if not within the board, then you need to get an expert to come and help you. But all in all, you need to make well-considered decisions. And you so correctly say that, to accept what you think somebody else knows, you're actually signing in for it, and you've actually committed yourself to something that you don't understand necessarily. And you may be right and you may be wrong. And it's not to say that any of us are perfect, but I think you've got to take every possible step to see that you are personally satisfied with what's put in front of you.
It's very difficult when it's deeply technical, like the things, the financial technicalities that Simon was talking about. I often, I've got the IT governance background, so I understand the deep technicalities and implications of things that those might not be understood by all directors. And of course, as we're moving now into beyond the financial, into the other capitals or into the ESG sustainability space, there's going to be other implications where the individual directors that are appointed or involved in committees, for example, independent committee members who are deeply experienced in those technical aspects, might assume that others also understand the implications of things, so maybe don't explain it fully. And management, of course, seeing the wood for the trees, maybe don't explain it properly. So Simon, your point is very, very well made. How, as a director, do you just need to ask the questions? I don't understand the implications of that. How do you go about being that nosy body in the meeting?
Well, for a non-exec, questions are your superpower. Some would say they're the only power you've got, but that is your weapon. You have to ask questions because you don't do anything. You don't run a team. You don't run a department, right? You ask questions and then you form a view on proposals. So the answer is you have to ask questions. And this is where experience really helps. And I focus on this a lot in my course and in the book, giving people help as to what questions to ask. So, for example, on derivatives, we've talked about derivatives. They're very complex. Even the CFO probably doesn't understand the full implications of the derivative he or she is currently proposing. So how could you as a non-exec? Well, in my book, there are 8 questions to ask. And those are the questions you should ask. And if you don't understand the replies, don't approve the derivative. That's my view. So, even in technical areas, there is help you can get of knowing exactly what to do. For example, on cybersecurity, the questions you have to ask are, what happens if it all goes wrong? Because the IT people always tell you, we've got so many mitigations that it won't happen that our server farm will go down. And the question non-exec has to say is, okay, I understand it'll never happen, but just humour me. What happens if it does go down? And then explain to me step by step what happens. And that's a technique I've used. And it's found, and I'm not an IT person, but it's found pretty horrendous IT issues. So I think, there's help you can get on what questions to ask. And of course, the more you talk to other colleagues, the more the questions will become obvious. And for example, if you've got a finance thing, talk to the CFO one-to-one in advance. IT, talk to the IT director, and the questions will emerge. The most dangerous thing is to say nothing. Now, I know that Patrice has asked the question. So, well, look, how Companies Act says, look, you can't stay silent. The trouble is, it's not as simple. I mean, that's great for a lawyer to write, but in a board meeting, you've got something that you maybe don't quite understand, you're not happy with. There's no law that can say you must make a fuss about that. You have to apply your judgment. Is it big enough for me to make a fuss about? So I think that's, questions, talk to people, research it, and keep asking the questions. I often say that being a non-exec is a bit like being Sherlock Holmes, because the executives will not give you all the answers. I mean, Geoff complained about the length of board papers, and I'm 100% with you, Geoff. A typical board could be 200 pages, and you might get another 200-300 pages from the audit committee and Remcom, and you might only have 2 days to read them, right? The thing is, they will not tell you what you need to know unless you've got absolutely brilliant executives. 95% of the case, they will not tell you the things they don't want you to know about, but there will always be clues. And you have to go through the papers, and you have to read them twice. Once won't do it. I'm sorry. You've got to read it twice. And you look for the clues. And it's just the clue that, a number looks a bit big. Or, hang on, didn't you say last time it was something like that? Or often I've said, there's a footnote on page 338. This footnote says this. How can that be? Does that accord with your experience, Geoff?
Yes, you are definitely correct. And the other thing I think you've got to be very mindful of as a non-executive director is you're not running the business. So you dare not overstep the mark of becoming operational. Yes, you need to get all the answers, but you're not there to run the business. And one's got to be very careful of that as a non-executive director, also very careful of that as a chairman. And I think, sort of if one goes back to Mervyn's insights as he's developed all his different papers and the King Commission, there's always been a suggestion that your chairman and CEO should be separate roles. They should not be together, because in that way, if you're doing both roles, there can be conflict. So you need to know your boundaries. And another very, very important thing for me is that there needs to be a focus. And I think you've brought it out 100% in what you've said, Simon. There needs to be a focus on the important things. There needs to be focused on the major risks, because it's that major event that hits the organization, which if you haven't seen it coming, is going to cause you irreparable harm. So, you're there as a custodian of the organization. It's a very important and a very, very onerous and a very expectant job. But you've got to realize I'm there to be a custodian of the organization, to guide and direct it.
Thank you, Geoff. It says your question, Simon, what happens if it all goes wrong? Geoff, are there any instances that you can talk about where that happened, where you could ask, what happens if this all goes wrong?
I don't know in the few that I've experienced whether it was a question that came up before time, or it was a question in looking back and say, why did it all go wrong? Yes, definitely, as one sits, there are times when things go wrong. To have the foresight to be able to prevent things from going wrong is you hope you've always got it, but sometimes that doesn't happen. There can also be outside events that cause something to go wrong, which you never in your wildest dreams expected. But in today's world of the technology and the cyber risks that exist, risk needs to be properly dealt with. And I've seen risks where people set out tens upon tens of risk. It's got to be a focused approach where you look at your major risks and deal with them and deal with the mitigation thereof. And I think all too often risks are not given sufficient time, and it's delegated to somebody, sometimes a financial director, sometimes a risk officer, but I don't think it's given sufficient attention. And I mean, if one listens to all the talk that's going on today around ESG, and one realizes the significance of what's happening around the world, the excesses, the shortages, the conflicts, and what that's doing to world markets, one's got to be very aware, and you've got to say, right, we're in the space of solar. Everybody's demanding solar. Can we supply? Can't we supply? Are we going to be short of stock? What's going to happen? That's a for instance, but depending on what realm you're in, you've got to realize what is happening in world events, and will that actually affect us as a company?
I think one of the questions, thanks, Geoff, is around sustainability and ESG, and maybe to you, Simon. The question from Ricardo is, any thoughts of what tools, skills, or knowledge should non-executive directors have to understand and be able to discuss this new emerging technical aspect of sustainability, and also called ESG?
I think ESG is a funny concept because G is very different to E and S, right? So G is probably what we're talking about the rest of this podcast, of this webinar. So if we talk about economic and sustainability, in the end, I think it's about doing the right thing. And I think there was a bit of a, I don't know whether you saw it in South Africa, but we certainly saw it here in Europe and the US, was the pandemic made boards stop and think. So, for example, a lot of the reaction to things like furlough payment, government subsidies, in the old days, we might have said, if somebody gives you a handout from the government, grab it and hold it and never give it back. There were far more discussions in boards as, is this right? Should we take this subsidy? Should we give it back? And I think that basic, is what is the right thing? We must do the right thing. And to me, this is so much more important, because the trouble with ES, the ES part of ESG, is that the regulators get involved and we end up with boilerplates and ticking boxes. And one of my companies, I can't remember, we had like 10 pages on ESG. We're a development company, right? Real estate company. We had about 10 pages of statistics, none of which, we really looked at, or very few of them. But, they were all required. And then the regulator got on to us and said, you've forgotten the statistic. And they were right. And I said to the CFO, has anybody, apart from the regulator, spotted that we forgot the statistic? No. I said, has anybody ever asked you about the ESG? No. So the thing I draw about this is the lesson that directors have to do what's right. And the problem is when there's regulation, it gets written by lawyers and politicians, and, producing 10 pages in an annual report does not solve problems. A bit like in the UK, the regulator is called the Financial Reporting Council. They're going to change the name, but anyway, that's it. And it's classic reporting. And they seem to think that the way that you improve board performance is by forcing people to write more things in their annual report. No good at all, right? You've got to help directors do the right thing.
Yeah. Geoff, comments on that?
Yes, I think it goes back to the whole principle around legislation. Is it there to guide people so that they don't think? Or is it there to hope that you'll get the right behavior? And I don't think any amount of legislation is ever going to help if people have got the wrong basic underlying values. And, you know, that's why it's so important also in a boardroom to know that you trust all the people around you. It's critical that you interact with them and that you value them. Because if that's not in place, then people are just looking for faults and they're not looking for opportunities. So I would say trust and respect is most probably, not only in the workplace, but at board level, at exco level, is most probably one of the most important things for a happy environment.
So that's one of the questions, is what happens if you do come across if your CEO starts underperforming, or even your chair, even worse, starts underperforming. Maybe Simon, you can give some insight into that.
Yeah, underperforming at board level is one of the trickiest problems you're going to come across. I mean, ironically, it's different. An underperforming CEO is one of the easier problems to sort. I mean, that seems crazy, but it is, because if they're underperforming, the non-execs and the chair will probably know. And it's a question of how do we handle the situation, right? I've not had a situation where people have said, where half the board thought the CEO was doing a great job and half thought they didn't. I've usually found it's pretty obvious when they're not doing a good job. The question is, what do you do about it? And what you need to appreciate here is that the chair is crucial, because you've got two options here. One is there may be a number two who you think could step up to be CEO either permanently or on interim basis, in which case terminating the CEO is relatively easy. But if you haven't got somebody within an executive within the business, then the chair has to step in, and the chair has to become interim CEO or executive chair. And in every chair role I've done, I've had to step in for various reasons, sometimes because of illness. So one of the issues is always there with an underperforming CEO is, what's the appetite of the chair to step down and start working 4 or 5 days a week instead of 1 day a week, and take all of the reputational risk of becoming a CEO, at least for a period of time. So that's the CEO. You always look at the chair and what is he or she thinking. I think if the chair is a problem, that's probably the toughest one you're going to get, because again, most non-execs don't want to make trouble. They don't want to have the nastiness of removing the chair, and there are generally no governance rules on how you remove the chair. It's generally assumed this isn't a problem. So removing the chair is much more difficult, and you need two things. One is you need pretty unanimity amongst the non-execs that this issue has to be taken seriously. And secondly, you probably need somebody who can stand up. It could step up, and it could be the senior independent director, SID, the most senior non-exec. But if they're not willing to, you've obviously got to find another interim chair at the time. On the other hand, if you don't tackle an underperforming chair, the board will become dysfunctional. It's very difficult to take decisions, the atmosphere in the board deteriorates, and it's just an unhappy situation for everybody. So I think that with the chair, just like any personnel decision, if you've got an underperformer, that you think you can't turn around, you're better off taking strong action now rather than dithering or hoping for something to happen.
Thanks, Simon. And Geoff, I mean, we don't like to think of our listed companies ever having a dysfunctional board, but what were the key indicators of a dysfunctional board if you see an organization from the side?
I think one of the worst things that happens in a board is vested interests. So in other words, where people are there for purposes other than making sure that the corporation is doing as well as it can in its chosen ambit. So where people are there for interests that do not underpin what the company is doing, or for self-serving interests, very quickly that can deteriorate into a dysfunctional board. I think one of the tragedies in our society is that we have a lot of state-owned enterprises. And what has happened in some of the state-owned enterprises that I've had the experience with is there's interference from the shareholder. And there's a lack of transparency. And you find yourself really being a puppet on the board, and very difficult to change and get the transparency that's required. And ultimately, there are underlying objectives, which are not the objectives of ensuring that the corporate is performing in the best possible way to make it the best environment for the employees, for the business itself. So those are really danger signals, and we've seen it very, very prominently in South Africa, sadly. Another thing to me that's also terribly important when one looks at a board, I suppose I'd use two words: health and education. One thing for sure, that especially in this world where there's so much talk now about mental health, I think you need to ensure that the board are healthy in the widest possible terms, whether that involves annual checkups or anything else. I think that's terribly important. And I also think another thing that's important, which is stipulated by many of the professional degrees, is ongoing education. But what you usually find is that the secretary is very active in getting people to come in and talk about important elements, but the very people who should be attending, who are on the board, do not attend. And that's, to me, a very, very big problem. Because obviously, as we all know, legislation changes, new things come on the table, like we've talked about ESG, we've talked about cyber, and therefore, people who have been on boards most probably need to be brought up to speed of what's happening out there in the environment, both locally and internationally. And as I say, the people who should really be at those education sessions, I've found over time, are the ones who don't attend, which is sad.
Mm-hmm. Very much so, and I think that's one of the reasons why the Good Governance Academy is trying to we collaborate and curate education programs such as those from Simon. You mentioned in terms of the state-owned entity interference from the shareholder, but equally so when you see multinationals with a large shareholding in an organization that's operating in another country, you find a little bit of that where the board feels like they haven't got authority. It's taken over by the majority shareholder, who also happens to be the mothership. But Simon, you've been through acquisitions where the big shareholder comes in, and tell us a little bit about the behind the closed doors in those scenarios.
Yeah, the thing about acquisitions is that bankers all think, and bankers love acquisitions, of course, because the fees are absolutely obscene. They all think the value is created by an acquisition. Acquisitions create no value whatsoever. Post-acquisition integration creates the value. If you buy another company and you pay $2 million for it, for example, you've not created any value whatsoever. The value comes from getting value out of the business that you've created. And that's why too many companies focus. I mean, you know, I've been in lots of situations. The focus on, do we pay 40 cents or 41 cents a share, right? And the bank has produced 30-page documents with lots of comparisons, blah, 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 right? And you agonize over half a cent or something. And what you should be doing is thinking, yeah, I know, but what are we going to do after we've acquired that business? Because there have been a number of occasions where, you know, the post-acquisition integration has been screwed up, even in simple business. I mean, there's a long example in my book of where two grocery chains, one took over another in the UK. And you would imagine that putting two grocery chains of not dissimilar size together was easy, because nobody's learning new techniques here. Okay, you've got two grocers coming together, right? It should be an easy acquisition, right? And they screwed it up badly, and they destroyed value. And then another example, you look at Hewlett-Packard and autonomy. I mean, Hewlett-Packard paid, I think it was $11 billion for autonomy, and 2 years later wrote off $9 billion of it. Now, that wasn't just post-integration there. They hadn't bought what they thought they'd bought, right? But it's a measure of, you know, on day one, you open the champagne, you've done a fantastic deal. The bankers and advisors are exceptionally excited because they get paid out and they go off and they get their bonuses. Meanwhile, you as the management have got the hard work. And I think that is the thing that I would focus people on most, is think about the post-acquisition work. That's the real work, because that's where the value comes. And, you know, if you screw that up, or if you do a brilliant job, whether you paid $1 or $2 million more or less for the acquisition will sort of recede, you know, into the distance. And I think the final point making acquisitions is, and this picks up a little something that Geoff said, which is understanding risk, which I agree with him. If there's one thing I would like boards really to understand in their day-to-day work, is understand risk properly and how you assess and manage risk. Because an acquisition is a hugely risky, and if you take activity, right? The grocery chain that bought the other one in my example lost huge amounts of value and a complete management change. The CEO of Hewlett-Packard was fired weeks after the autonomy acquisition. So an acquisition is an existential risk or crisis for both the acquirer and, of course, the acquired. So, you know, when you're doing it on a board, so much focus is on, you know, there's a lot of machismo. It's the chase, it's the hunt, it's the tactics. It's all jolly, jolly exciting, right? It's all a bit like James Bond, you know, all sorts of things hanging around and secret meetings and don't tell anybody, blah. But the hard work and the performance measure is the day, the week, the year after an acquisition.
And the board has to keep on top of that. Sorry, Geoff, yes.
Just like to add in, I think that, you know, one of the biggest things also when an acquisition is done is understand the stakeholders. Understand that the due diligence has covered all the aspects that you need to have sight on. You know, there are certain organizations which are beholden to the labor unions. If you don't understand what their demands are and where that is in process, you can find yourself severely hampered about being able to run a business. And so, the wide spectrum of what you've expected to know as a non-executive director is immense. And it's not just very narrow, it's wide. And I would just stress and know and understand who the stakeholders are in the particular business and what impact they have in the running of the business. Because ideally you may think everything is plain sailing, but as has been discovered in some of the takeovers, it's not the case. And, when we talk about stakeholders, they range from the policymakers to the unions.
And these are really just, sorry, Simon, yes?
Yeah, just building on Geoff's point, which I agree with, particular stakeholder you should be looking at is the management of the company that is being acquired. I mean, it's a statement of the obvious, surely, that when you put two businesses together, it should be best man for the job. Okay, best woman, best person for the job. And yet, the reality, that isn't what happens in most occasions. A lot of companies will acquire another and then have a burnt earth policy. And of course, if you lose or you fire or you make redundant, all of the people who know how the business works, the business that you're acquiring, know where the skeletons are hidden. Don't be surprised if it all becomes screwed up. And it's a sort of, I talked to you and you said, well, surely nobody could be that stupid. Yeah, I'm afraid rather a lot of us are that stupid. And, you don't often get, except really in very specific people businesses, the acquirer company saying, best man for the job, and we really want to retain the management, because after all, you've just conquered them, right? So all your managers want to be conquerors and they want the top jobs.
Very difficult. Again, it's about people.
It is about people, and you've also got to be careful what you remunerate for.
Now that's a good question. When people are expecting bonuses and the company doesn't perform well or people don't perform well, that's a very difficult position to be in. Just another board dilemma is, how do you go about putting effective remuneration in place, and doesn't just become unexpected at the end of the year? Maybe Geoff, to you around remuneration, and then Simon.
It is a very difficult point. It depends on the sort of organization you've got. And in most organizations, they've got a lot of different departments. So some may perform very well and others may perform very badly. But are you part of the whole, or are you an independent silo? And I think those are the decisions you've got to make up front. Because if an organization is silo, it's unlikely that there's going to be cooperation and best output. But those are the considerations you've got to have when you think about remuneration, how the business is run, how it's structured. It's very intricate and very complex, and most probably varies from business to business. And with Simon having mentioned that sometimes you've got overseas corporations in foreign countries, the values are different, the mode of operating is different, and you've got to be very careful how you set yourself up. And what really comes in very, very strongly is the HR directors of immense importance in most organizations, because hopefully they understand the business and the culture of the people, and therefore can suggest the best possible remuneration structures, working, and what they're given to do.
Thanks, Geoff. Simon, any generic hints and tips around this thorny subject?
I think, when you think about remuneration, I think you need to think about, one is ethics, okay? Two is market practice, which increasingly tends to mean what your shareholders want or what proxy advisors want, right? And then third is what's best for your company. Now, if you can have a remuneration policy that meets all of those, That's fantastic. Well done. If, for example, you have a policy that's ethical and you think it's right for the company, but it's not in line with market practice, that's what I call a brave remuneration policy, because I fully appreciate it's ethical, it's right for the company, but you're going to have a fight with shareholders, right? And you'll have a fight not just with shareholders in South Africa, but all your foreign shareholders with different rules may well intervene. And you may be subject to what the proxy authorities, proxy agencies want. So I think it's very difficult to match all three of those. I would say that with performance targets, I think there are two things. One is make them specific, because executives tend to write themselves non-specific performance targets, right? I mean, the things
much
like
easier.
have a well motivated team, and what does that mean? So I think specific performance targets, but always retain discretion, because often unexpected things happen. In fact, unexpected things happen all the time these days. And if, for example, if you are in an energy company at the moment, you're probably making money hand over fist, particularly if you've got the source generation or extraction in your company. It's got absolutely nothing to do with how brilliant you are. It's because Putin invaded Ukraine and the world price of energy has rocketed. So, the remuneration committee or need to sit and say, are we rewarding executives for windfall gains, or is it something that they've done? And I think if you step back, for example, and this is a good example, because say your management team had said, we want to really, really invest in oil reserves or gas reserves. And we know that it's a bit, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, world price wasn't so high, but we think the energy market is going to contract. And we really think there's opportunity. If they did that, you might say, well, okay, you predicted it. You didn't know how it was going to happen, but you predicted it. And so we overinvested and now we're making money, in which case bonus is due. But if, frankly, they didn't foresee it like anybody else and they're just making money because of Putin, do you pay out a full whack? And I think that's the sort of question. And it's quite difficult because you're sitting around a board table. If you're talking about the executives here, not just executives on the board, but the level below, you know them, you're friendly with them, possibly, you like them, presumably, they're colleagues, and yet you're deciding their pay. And I think as a non-exec, it's an awful lot easier just to pay and not have a fight than to say, I don't think we should. That's not in the interest of our shareholders. And I think that's a real moment of truth for remuneration committees.
Very difficult. And specifically in South Africa, where we have the worst Gini coefficient in the world. It's a really sticky point. And I think that's why in South Africa, unlike in other governance codes, remuneration is a key governance principle. There's a whole lot written on it because it's a sticky issue. I see there's another question here around the compliance and education. It was a while ago, it comes from Gavin. Can either of you comment on experience in guiding a board and its performance from its early days through positions of progressing from conformance or compliance through to becoming competent and truly using board performance and the board performance review process to improve? So actually using the board performance to drive the performance of the organization, I think is what Gavin's trying to say.
Okay, I'll have a bash at it. I was actually just looking at that question. I think one of the most important things for all of us is when you go onto a board as a newbie, as one would call it, it's wonderful to have a mentor or a guiding hand or somebody who really is prepared to sit and chat to you about what's coming in the next board meeting, how you should apply your mind, what you should be thinking of, why you're there, I think all that sort of guidance over and above what one may learn from textbooks and from reading is invaluable. So I would say to have a mentor, it's very interesting because there's often, there's so much today in the world that says, I need mentorship, I want mentorship. And yet, to my mind, no matter what position you sit in a company or corporation, you should be mentoring everybody around you, because that's part of your own growth and part of the growth of the people around you. And it's the same as for me as somebody new coming into the boardroom. They've got to be helped and guided and handheld so that they feel welcome, number one, because if they don't feel welcome, they're never going to talk. And, that's another very important thing for me, for a chairman, to make sure that there's contribution from everybody. That, not only is the chairman, I'm going to call it well disposed towards the CEO and management, but he's well disposed, and she well disposed towards all the people on the board, so much so that they can push for answers, get people to contribute. So the simple answer is, you need somebody who's going to handhold you and take you through from being a newbie to feeling that you're welcome and you can contribute.
Thank you, Geoff. Simon, from your perspective, and I think this is the last question we can take, unfortunately, it's gone very quickly.
And it's a great question too, actually. That sort of journey of a board from a group of people who don't really know about governance to turning to a high-performing, good governance board. That's a fascinating experience. I've seen it a couple of times in my career. I think there are a couple of things to say. One is you do need somebody who understands how well-run companies manage themselves, measure themselves, and govern themselves. Now, that person, it could be a mentor, a little bit as Geoff was talking about. It's easier if it's the chair, but you certainly need somebody on the non-exec who knows what good practice is, and that will save you an awful lot of time. The second point is that not everybody is going to be with you for that whole journey. There are some people who are not going to be able to adapt. And you can't fool yourself. At some point, you're going to have to say, it's a bit like a sports team that gets promoted. You know that some of those people in that promoted team will be able to develop and perform at the higher level, and some won't. So I think spotting, and I think where I've seen difficulty doing it, is where there's been an emotional and longevity reason why people have wanted to hold on to directors who frankly, they're too old to change. I don't mean to be ageist, but too set in their ways to change, maybe not sharp enough, not bright enough to be able to change. And I think there you've got to take action, because you can't drag a board screaming into the 21st century, right? They've got to want to change, and you'll have people who don't know what to do, but they'll listen and they'll spot, oh, that's a good idea, let's do that. And there'll be people who say, nah, we tried that 50 years ago, it didn't work. That nonsense, and they have to go. So I think, it's having experience on the board, and it's having the right people, and it's not having the wrong people. I think those are the most important. And then finally, it takes time. It's not going to happen overnight. It is a process of evolution, but it is jolly good fun. I've been on a board where we've IPO'd as a very, very small board, as a private company, and turned into a modern functioning listed company. And it's a great journey to be on. It's one of the most fun things you can do, but there will be pain on the path, I'm afraid.
And with that, if I can say, Prof. Mervyn King says, you being a chair is supposed to be honorific, but most often it is horrific because of these difficult decisions. And so thank you very much to Simon and to Geoff for joining us today. Those who want to buy Simon's book, I can highly recommend it. It is on the platform. You can click the link through there to get Amazon, Kindle, download, paperless or paper book. The video will be uploaded to the webpage. So if you have colleagues, and I see there were a couple that had to drop off early, you can go and have a look at that, the recording on the webpage. And of course, the training, please get in touch. You heard today what Simon, the insight Simon can give to everyone, and what being a Streetwise director is all about. So thank you very much to Simon and to Geoff and to everyone online for joining. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye
you.
now.
Thank you all.
Bye.